Welcome to the Empowered Living Zone, where you can create the life you crave. With me, Dr. A, as a psychologist for over 30 years, a transformational life coach, and an expert in self-empowerment, my life's work has been inspired by the beautifully powerful resilience of the human spirit. We will share stories and successes of people who have not only overcome personal adversity, but have used their traumas and hardships courageously as a springboard into greatness. Create positive transformational shifts on your way to achieving phenomenal success. Get ready to level up as you move beyond the challenging terrain of your life's journey into the empowered living zone. Ignited by spirit, fueled by purpose, and guided by vision, the Empowered Living Zone show starts now. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. A, and you're listening to the Empowered Living Zone on Transformation Talk Radio. And with me today is my guest, Dr. Pat Baccili. Dr. Pat is an international award-winning talk radio host, TV commentator, certified career and belief coach, dynamic seminar leader and inspirational speaker, award-winning author and researcher, and the CEO and owner of a successful inspirational company, Unlimited Possibilities Now. Dr. Pat is well respected in various roles in the human potential field, and she has received numerous awards for empowering message on the radio. I'm deeply grateful and honored to have Dr. Pat join me today. Welcome, Dr. Pat. It's great to see you.
It's great to be picking up this topic and doing part 2 of this. Thank you so much for continuing the ego journey.
Oh, yes. We could spend a lot of time talking about that old dreaded ego, can't we?
I told you, you had me dust off some old books. Yes. And really, I'm not kidding. And, you know, from back in the day of my consulting, corporate, you know, and what's funny is when you dust them off, especially about ego, you find some things that you hadn't remembered. And that's why we're doing this show, isn't it? There are just ideas that we all have to remember about this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, we are talking about ego again today. And there's a really important reason for it, Dr. Pat. You know, what I find really interesting is how little people know about their psychological anatomy or even their spiritual anatomy. And I don't know how people how they do with their physical anatomy, but most people know what a heart is and what a stomach is and what intestines are. And, you know, they have some basic understanding of their physical body, but very few people have a real understanding of our psychological and spiritual anatomy. And so I think it's really important to go into these topics with some detail so that our listeners can walk away with an understanding of how they operate. Because when we don't have this basic understanding of our psychological anatomy, what we can do is we can make the mistake of making every experience we have as the truth with a capital T, the only thing that exists. When what we're going to learn today, and, you know, forgive my French on this, this is an affectionate term that I use often, you know, referring to the ego as the sneaky little bastard, because it is very cunning. It can be very sneaky. It's very, very, very intelligent and very manipulative. And we're going to get into that because I know last week when we spoke, Dr. Pat, you know, I was talking about how important our ego is, despite popular belief that it's something that we want to get rid of. You know, yes, it is important in our daily functioning, and we can use it to our benefit. However, if we're not in charge of it, it can wreak havoc in our lives, big time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well, you know, and one of the things, it's not just in our personal lives. It's like anybody that's listening to this that has a job. Let's just talk to you for a minute, because there's such transference when we're talking about the ego in our day-to-day, whether I'm playing soccer or I'm watching a movie. And then there's the other part. Now it's me, my ego in my career. Mm-hmm. That is the big tent for the ego. It loves to see how far we can overextend ourselves in search of pleasing itself.
Yeah. And it's never enough.
It's never enough. It's never enough. You know, it's like my friend said, I don't agree with this analogy, but my friend said the ego is like solar energy right now. I said, what do you mean? It's never enough, but it will be someday. And I thought, well, what do you mean about that with the ego? Are we going to evolve for that? And I'm just interested in, fast forward from last episode to where we are today. What is our experience of ourselves? Can you talk to that? When we say I, what do I mean when I say I? And if I say I in one tone versus another, how many different faces of my ego are showing up?
Yeah. The ego is very complex, Dr. Pat. And what I find really interesting, and as the listeners may know, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've been doing this a really long time. And one of the experiences that I'm often struck by when working with my clients is how they will discuss an experience. And the ego is actually it's symbiotic with the experience. It's like my clients don't separate. I am having this experience. Instead, it is I am this experience. Whether it's a belief, whether it's certain thoughts floating around in the mind or emotions, they don't separate that. And I find that really, really very intriguing because we, as I had mentioned before, we aren't those things. You're talking about, let's get into our psychological anatomy. And, just like we have our heart in our body and we need our heart, if we don't have our heart pumping blood, we're not going to live, just like we need our brain. And our ego is necessary for our psychological anatomy. And basically what the ego is, and this is the mistake that people make, is the ego is an awareness. It's not the experience itself, but it's an awareness. It's the experience of I or me in any kind of experience we're having in life. And so the mistake that I see people make is they put those two things together. So what is really important is the ego is necessary, just like our heart or our brain is necessary for our physical anatomy. Our ego is absolutely necessary for our psychological makeup. And so the I awareness is what's really important. And we'll get into that a little bit in a little bit more detail to understand why I keep making this distinction between conscious awareness and experience. This is critical in order to change things for us in our experience. So we can often think about the ego as the middleman. It's like middle management, so to speak. So we're having all these internal experiences in our minds, right? We're having thoughts, we're having impulses, we're having feelings. It's a constant commentary. It doesn't ever stop in our waking lives. And so the ego becomes the middleman between our internal experience and the external experience. So in some ways it's transactional. It's being in charge of this interaction between the internal experience of ourselves and the outside world. So that's really important. Yeah. The other distinction that I want to make is there's a difference between ego and mind. Ego is part of the mind, but it is not the mind. The mind is like a raw apparatus that is continually, constantly processing, taking information in, interpreting it, using past experiences to understand and interpret information. That is not the ego, that is the mind. It's the processes that are the mind. The ego is the awareness behind that mind.
Yeah, I love this because, look, let's boil this down for people. Why are you and I talking about this? We're going through a crisis right now. And it is a crisis that we're not talking about. It's not about the economy or stock market. We are in a place now coming off of 4 years of what we have referred to as a pandemic. It was a game changer. It was life altering. It changed the direction for people. It changed the relationships for people. Many lives were lost. But what came out of it is the personal struggle for identity, competency, value, worth, and responsibility. the struggle that the ego loves to take that. Like when the ego gets this, it's like making a meatball. It's like making my grandma's meatball. It can't wait to take all of those ingredients, all of those doubts, throw them in to have a juicy bite of struggle.
Absolutely. It loves it. It loves it.
I love my grandma's meatballs, by the way.
Right? And the crazy part of this, Dr. Pat, is as long as we're awake, our ego is running. It is going. It is online 100% of the time. There is a constant narrative. If people pay attention, it's almost like elevator music or waiting room music. It's always there. Whether we're conscious of it or not, it is always there. And so that's really important because we're constantly being influenced by it. And if we're not plugging into the awareness of it, then we are being driven by this constant narrative in a very unconscious and disempowering kind of way.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to talk, there's a lot to talk about today, but there's a reason that you're bringing this up, Dr. A. And, the reason that you're bringing it up is so that we understand. It's like I said to you before, I dusted the cover off of this book, which used to be one of my go-tos. This is a 1993 book. And the language in it, if there was an update to this book, and it probably is, I don't know, but you're going to have to cover this in the book that you're writing. But what we're looking at here is the language. If you didn't know it was 1993 and I read from it, you would be thinking it was like this year the book came out. Why is that? Why is it that fast forward, how many years is that? 1993 to where we are today. And you could read from a book on the ego and still think it's applicable in today's world. Does that mean the ego is more resilient than we know?
Right. Well, and we'll dig into that question, Dr. Pat, when we return. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll dig into those details. You are listening to the Empowered Living Zone with Dr. A and Dr. Pat. We'll see you shortly. We are back on the Empowered Living Zone with me, Dr. A, and Dr. Pat, and we're going to just dive down into this ego thing. And Dr. Pat, right before our break, you brought up an interesting question that, you pulled out this old textbook from 1993. And as you were reviewing it, you were like, oh my goodness, this could have been written for today. And your question was, why is that? And I'm curious, I'd like to hear your theory about why this feels relevant today as it was 30 years ago.
It's relevant today, I think, because the ego is the best adaptogen known to mankind. Adaptogens are vegetables, fruit, maca root, but the ego is a phenomenal adaptogen. It takes multi-generational sets of information. It takes, some people believe, multiple lives of information, and it takes them on a journey that many of us don't understand. We don't know what the goal is. But then again, that's the ego. And I think the book is relevant today, especially this book. This was one of the first books to talk about setting the spirit free. That's their language, and tapping ego energy. This is one of the first books that came out that used ego and energy in the same language and the word spirit. And so that's why I kept the book and threw all the rest out, probably. But what is the message today in the world? Because so often we hear ego talked about in really horrible terms. And I don't believe that that's it at all. I think the ego is instrumental in our evolution.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm taking this in as you're saying this, Dr. Pat, and it's like this really speaks to its brilliance. In the sense of when you look at ourselves, you human species, and you look at evolution and the things that have changed over time for us to adapt to our environments. And I will tell you, I think the ego is more fast adapting than our physical beings in terms of evolution. And that's what really, that says a lot about its brilliance. I mean, it's brilliant because it can adapt so quickly. Okay. And at the same time, it can be the bane of our existence because of its brilliance and its cunning and its ability to adapt. And you can listen to many spiritual teachers or motivational speakers or inspirational speakers, and many of them will talk about the ego, and they will talk about no matter how much personal work you do, and no matter how much awareness you have, it can still pull one over on you if you're not paying attention. And again, I want to make it clear that does not make it an enemy to us. It's whether or not we use it to our advantage or we allow it to beat us down. It really comes down to that. And I think about my own personal experience. I would consider myself a person who is very committed and invested in my own growth and evolution. And I believe that, I have great awareness. And I will tell you, into present time, I can catch myself, following the ego and letting the ego be in charge of my experience. And again, hence the sneaky little bastard is like, oh my God, it got me again. Here I am, and I think it's really important. To recognize, these very kind of dichotomous kinds of experiences with the ego.
Yeah. And, let's talk about the effect of the ego, because the ego is not just something that's just floating around, it has an entire impact on our physiology, on our emotional state. I mean, let's talk about the interconnective wiring that the ego can do or undo or not do in the rest of who we are in the world. Isn't this why we're talking about it? It's not like it's just a floaty thing. It's something that could literally drive us in one direction or the other. We'll either go right or we'll go left, or maybe we won't go at all. But the ego may have a part in that, correct? So
Absolutely.
what happens when the ego kicks in then?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think what's important is to think about it. It is intricate. You talked about it being interconnected. It's very intricate. And here's where things can kind of run amok is when I talk about the ego being the middleman, the ego is not only the middleman with the essence is, it's in service of the essence and it goes out into the world and creates. It's the middleman. It's also the middleman in the sense of our mind. Like if we were to look at, so let's look at this. Let's look at this from the perspective, or use the analogy of a computer. We think about what computers do. And in some ways, our mind and our ego and our nervous system is similar. It's like our mind is like the CPU, the core processing unit of a computer. It's taking in data and it's doing something with that data, right? And then your nervous system, it's almost like it's the motherboard. So the CPU unit gets plugged into the motherboard, and then the ego is like the operating system. So they all work together. And the ego is a middleman, because what'll happen is the mind is constantly online while we are awake. We are taking everything in through our senses, whether it's sight, whether it's sound, whether it's proprioception. We're taking in information, and our mind is interpreting the meaning of that information. And sometimes the mind uses past experiences, but the mind is taking that information. Okay, at exactly the same time, our nervous system is online as well 100% of the time, and it's evaluating whether that information is a threat or not. Is it a threat to my safety or not? The ego is connected to both. So what's fascinating about this is, as you were saying, Dr. Pat, is that the ego can really determine, are we going to go left or are we going to go right? Are we going to have an experience that thrusts us in a very powerful and a great fun way towards something we really want? Or is it going to pull us out of something and have us kind of constrict and be in a ball, of nothingness? And it can be that extreme. And part of the reason why is because it is connected to the nervous system. If the ego, and let's talk a little bit about the ego, the ego's job, it has a couple of jobs. One of its biggest jobs is to preserve well-being. That is really important. Well, what does that mean in today's world? Centuries ago, hundreds and thousands of years ago, when we were cavemen, well-being was purely physical. It was like, am I going to survive? Am I going to be eaten? And that's what our nervous system was. In today's time with evolution, our threats are emotional. Our threats are to our sense of identity. And again, it's interesting as I do the kind of work I do, how fascinating people will have knee-jerk reactions to, I've got to defend myself. And it's like, well, what are you defending? Well, I got to defend what they think about me, or I got to defend my image, or, and so our sense of threat has shifted. It has shifted to preserving what I think about myself and my self-concept.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I love about this, in that book I flashed up a little bit ago, it's really a well-written book, and that it goes and introduces a new term, ego energy. And they asked at the time, the leaders in this field, what is it? And, you have different definitions, but the one that I think you'll relate to, because this is pivotal to, empowered living and the empowered living zone. The one that's pivotal is Dealer Hawkins. When they were asked the nature of the ego, they said very simply, the essential component of ego energy is human spirit. Now, you see that? Mm-hmm. Not the brain, human spirit. And when they go on to talk about that, they're talking about the things that define us in that. Self-esteem, huge part of any kind of conversation about ego. You have to have self-esteem or self-worth in the conversation. But what you're talking about is also the safety to protect those things. You see, we're not just protecting ourselves from a lion or a bear, to your point earlier. But now, if we see ourselves as the human spirit, then what are we protecting? Well, we could be protecting how we feel about ourselves, how confident we are, how we walk through the world. And those things, they are so complex. They are very, very difficult. They're dynamic, they're interrelated, and sometimes intermeshed in ways of past issues and traumas. So the ego, it's not a surprise. It's working 24/7 because that's what the human spirit does, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's exactly what it does. And you're right. It is running, it is running 24/7. It's online 100% of the time. And one of the things that can give it power is our nervous system. If our ego senses some kind of threat to our well-being, it immediately kicks in our autonomic nervous system for fight, flight, or freeze. And so it amplifies the power of that story, and then it creates some kind of emotional reaction or response that impels us. It's like we have to do something with it. There's some kind of behavior that comes out of those experiences. And so, something to think about is it's on 100% of the time. It is running a continual commentary. There is always a narrative. If we ever stop and pay attention, you can ask yourself, what is my ego telling me now? What is my ego telling me now? And so, your ego is like a storyteller in your mind, and it's crafting a narrative all of the time about who you are, how the world works, how you fit into the world. And its primary goal is to keep you safe emotionally and to preserve what you believe about yourself and what you believe about others and the world. And the narrative impacts your thoughts, it impacts your feelings, it impacts your behaviors, it impacts your interactions with others. And sometimes it's the thing that is driving you to seek validation and to, again, preserve who you believe you are. So here's what's important about this. This is the fork in the road, Dr. Pat, because it's through these narratives that the ego can either be our friend and help us go into the direction where we want to go, or it can be our foe. And ultimately, it can be quite cunning, and it's persuading you to believe that it has your back. when in reality, it doesn't.
Ah.
Okay. Let's let that sink in for a moment, Dr. Pat.
Yeah. I think this is good. I know that we're going to come to a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about this. And there are solutions. There are definitely things that we can look at because the ego has enormous power to self-adjust. It has enormous power in helping us deal. Think about it. The degree by which you are confident and believe you have a high worth is the degree by which you'll be able to overcome every emotional challenge in life. Now, having said that, the ego runs that show. Right?
Absolutely.
So understanding it and using it to your benefit, that's what today's conversation is about.
Yes. Okay. There's a lot to take in here, Dr. Pat, and we'll let the listeners let this all sink in. We're going to take a quick break. And when we get back, we'll talk about how the ego can either run amok in our lives or it can help us in empowering ways to create experiences that we want. You're listening to the Empowered Living Zone with Dr. A and Dr. Pat, and we'll be back shortly. We're back on the Empowered Living Zone with me, Dr. A, and Dr. Pat. And before we dive into this, if you would like to have the opportunity to work with me, or you would like to learn more about the empowered living and psychospiritual transformational life coaching, you can reach me through my website, www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. That's www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. All right, let's dive into this. So, Dr. Pat, we were talking about how, it's funny because, in my world, as a coach and as a psychologist, we try to stay away from either or thinking.
Why do we do that? I have a little bit more flexibility than I think you do because of my career path. Probably my ego did this to me. When I graduated, I had a choice. I had multiple choices. I had multiple opportunities. My research was groundbreaking, but completely depressive. It's just totally depressing, right? I finished that. Yes, it won awards, all sorts of great things, and I couldn't move from my couch for 6 months. That's call it what you want. When everybody around me was like, "Well, you should be happy," right? I'm like, "Oh no, I'm not." I'm depressed. I have 1,200 pages of interview notes, and now you're telling me you want me to do postdoctorate studies? I'm depressed. I'm not coming out of my house. Do you understand there's a problem? We don't care. Do the research. And somehow you find your way to pick yourself up. But I got to a choice point after I finished all that where in my state at the time, in order for me to be a registered clinical psychologist, I couldn't say the words astrology or spirituality in my sessions. Now, my friends tell me I should have researched that before I went to school for 10 years and entered a profession I wasn't going to do. But my ego was impacted by that. It had a hit until I realized this was never my path to be a clinical psychologist. And why is that? You see, we could get caught up, and I think you're going to talk to this today. We can get caught up in the disappointments in our lives, and we can see them as failure. But I don't believe the ego wants us to do that. See, I don't believe that the word failure is something the ego even understands. What's your thought on that one?
Well, ultimately, the bottom line is the ego is looking out for us, right? And if you think about if we're trying very hard to preserve who we believe we are, then the ego is going to really motivate us in such a way that failure is not an option. And so when you think about that, its intention is good. Right? It's got a good intention, but we all know about good intentions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions sometimes, right? Yet at the same time, I don't want to lose sight of that, because what can happen is if we use our ego in a conscious way, in a deliberate way, in a purposeful way where we are in charge of it. The I of ourselves is in charge and essence is involved, then it has a very different outcome. If I think about the ego, being middle management and sometimes forgetting what its job is and wanting to have too much power. And what it does is it will often push us and push us and push us, because of our fears of failure, because of our need to save face. And so in some ways, it's interesting having conversations with clients where they're not willing to let this go because it's like, I am successful because of my ego. And I don't doubt that. I can look at myself as an example. Yes, I'm successful as a result of that constant pushing of the ego. Yet it comes at a cost.
Yeah.
When the ego is running the show, and I want to make this distinction too, Dr. Pat. It's not, again, joking about the dichotomy and the either or thinking. It's when our ego is in its default mode. Okay, so our default mode is all of these things that I've talked about. We're never enough. There isn't enough. Everything is a threat. I think about the adage. Have you ever heard the adage, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail? Well, from the ego, everything's a threat. Everything is a threat. And so when it gets really off track into this default mode, it's going to wreak havoc in our lives. It's going to cause a lot of suffering. I don't know if you've had that experience. It sounds like you might have with your studies.
Yeah, multiple times in my life. But these are the things that we grapple with, right? Somebody asked me, oh man, like a bunch of years ago, I can't remember. Why did I come on this path? Why the Transformation Network? And I used to not know, but I do know now. And I studied in that 10-year journey that was so depressing I just described. I studied a lot of things that I wasn't aware of. I just didn't show up here the way I am today. This took work. And part of that was going back to school and really being able to spend time in figuring out what I'm about, what I want to be about. And along that journey, one of my research books didn't get included in my research. They didn't think it was appropriate in my research. I did include it later on as a reference, was Power versus Force by David Hawkins. And that book was so instrumental in redoing this, right? Redoing who am I in the world? What is this about? This is the book that came out and said before all the other people, before the what the bleeps and all, this is the guy that came out and said energetic vibrations suggest positive thoughts and emotions create higher energetic vibrations. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, our crazy ego does not like to hear that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because what it's saying is if you create something of a higher vibration, it will create more of a higher vibration. And of course, there's much more than this. It's a positive mindset. But that's why this network got created. The influence of books like this and my own way to rewire some things of my past, open the new door. Isn't that also part of the ego? Is its ability to allow us, and I say this carefully, allow us to change for the better.
Yeah, isn't that it's what makes it so intricate and complex. It's like it's the friend and the foe at the same time. It's the part the part of us that is brilliant and magical and can get us where we want to go, and it can also take us to our knees. And I find that just powerful in either direction. It's very powerful. And what I'm struck by, and it's funny because you think about the whole energy thing and you think about vibrations, and we have energy, we have emotional experiences, and a lot of us don't understand or appreciate how emotions actually do have energy. they do have energy. And, when we're at a higher vibration or higher emotional vibration, we have different experiences and we see things differently, experience things differently, and things come into our radar screen in a different way than if we're at a lower vibration. And that's why all of this is really, really important. And it's interesting because I'm thinking about this as we're talking about this, Dr. Pat, and I don't want to confuse the listeners or myself, but it's amazing what this ego is, because it's like it plays all these different roles all at the same time. And mastery, this is what we're searching for. This is what we're going for. There's nothing to fix. There's nothing wrong with us. It's mastery. It's learning how to use these elements of ourselves in a way to create something that we really want to experience in our lives.
Yeah. I mean, Hawkins says it interestingly, exactly the way you said it. Basically, the true power of any person doesn't lie in our ability to control others. It lies in our ability to control ourselves. Okay, I'm paraphrasing that, so don't email me if I misquoted him, but that's the point, right? I mean, it's this little book that came out that had lasting impact on quite a few people. But the things that are being said, I don't care how many years ago they were written, in the world we live in today, the work that you do with organizations and individual, this is, I believe, when people ask, what is the greatest psychological, sociological challenge we have? It is going to be able to understand the ego, understand how it works for you and works against you, because social media, connecting, evaluating, assessing, judging, comparing, they're not going to go away. They're going to be in our face more than we even know. So what do we do about it, Dr. A?
Absolutely. And, when you're talking about these different kinds of platforms, the ego can have a feast on these platforms. You look at what's going on in these platforms, you see, comparison, they say comparison is the thief of joy, right? Comparison, judgment, haters, you have all of these things, and the ego feeds on that. And it can create so much suffering. It can cause so much suffering.
Yeah. I mean, let me just clarify. Hawkins also said true power is grounded in humility, while force is driven by the ego. I mean, it's an interesting guy to watch or listen to or read the books about, but he was very clear in Power versus Force. Power is the thing each of us really needs to experience in this life, because nobody likes to feel powerless or power over. And yet this idea of force is driven by the ego. I mean, think of what driven by the ego can cause in society.
Oh, we're already seeing it. Right? We're already seeing it. Yeah. We see it all over the place. And these are all examples of when the ego's in charge. The ego is not designed to be in charge. The ego is in service. The ego is in service of our being, of our spirit. We could spend hours talking or discussing examples in our world of where the ego has really gone amok. It's run amok. I mean, I think about our own personal experiences, Dr. Pat. I mean, I'm sure, I can speak for myself, if I'm not being mindful, I can have at least experience a day where it's like, there's the ego again. Oh, there's the slave. I call him the slave driver sometimes, the whip cracker, it can be pretty brutal.
And I think this is part of it, right? This discovery and level of awareness is where you have to start, because it's hard to take all of these quotes and put them into context and say, oh, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do what he says. But you don't have the tools to understand it. And I think you have to have your ego detector on. You have to be able to discern, what's going on here? Am I driving? Force? Does it feel like force? Where's that going? What's that going to get me? 3 hours sleep? Is it, all of these things that are now combined. And yet we have so many tools people can use. But I worry if we're normalizing ego's chaos. I just worry about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think
that's like we almost normalized the word narcissist. Yeah. Such a bad thing. What do you think?
Well, I think what's happening is that we're all, you think about the concept, and for those of us who've been in sociology or psychology, and you know about the concept groupthink. It's almost like an extension of groupthink. It's like we're all ego think. Our society supports it. There's lots of our egos are thriving, in the default mode, and I want to make that clear. The default mode, it's thriving because our society supports it, and we're all, as a society, most of us are driven by this default mode of our ego. You can see it everywhere. You can see it in the news. You can see what, the current events, and you see that all over the place, Yeah. I want to, what I'd like to do, Dr. Pat, if you're up for this, is, kind of make this real for the readers, the listeners, the listeners, because, I want this, I want the listeners to be able to walk away and go, oh, that's when the default mode is in, right? Because we're talking about these things, and we're talking about them in a more kind of theoretical or hypothetical kind of way. And I'd love for my listeners to be able to have some tools. And, there's definitely very definable experiences when your ego is running amok. And what I have found, Dr. Pat, and the work that I have done, and I'll actually apply this to myself personally. I'll full disclosure here. A lot of times, when I'm working with my clients, this is the case, and this is the case with me, is I don't recognize that my ego is running amok until I recognize I'm aware of my feeling. So a lot of times I will have a characteristic kind of feeling where I feel it can be a couple of things. I could be in a panic, like there's just this panic, like, oh no, and my heart's racing. And, I call it the Chicken Little syndrome. The sky is falling. You're like, oh my God, my life is going to end in this moment. Yeah. You know what that feels like, right?
Oh, I do. I had a moment like that last night, actually. And it kicks in at times where we need to, look, if you've ever taken care of a sick friend and they go and they have a moment, they have an event, you're not to join them in the pain and the chaos that they may experience from an event. It doesn't matter if it's coughing, it's breathing, you don't join them. You have to keep your composure. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to manage that ego energy, because their fear and your fear doesn't make no fear. Fear plus fear equals more fear. And the ego would love that sometimes.
Thrives on it. So, that's one emotional experience. I think the other one I often feel is a sense of defeat. Like I feel just a heaviness and a defeat. So typically I'm aware, or my first moment of awareness that my ego's kind of running amok is actually on a feeling state. And that's right. Pretty common for most people. They just don't have the level of awareness. So a lot of times you have a feeling, and typically when we have heavy feelings that are either creating a sense of urgency and panic or a sense of despair and defeat, I will guarantee you your ego is running amok. And usually what happens is you stop for a moment and you pay attention. All you have to do is go, what is my ego telling me right now? What's the story? What's the story I'm spinning? And typically what you'll find is there'll be stories. It'll be either your inner critic has just kicked in. So we'll at some point later down the road, we'll talk about the critic, because the critic is alive and well in all of us. It is a component of the ego. And, it's harsh, it's judgmental. It's talking in absolutes, all or nothing kind of thinking, black and white kind of thinking, and it's just looping. It's the same story over. It's like we're getting beat up. We're beating ourselves up with the same story. And so that's always a good sign that we're in, that the ego's in charge, running amok,
Yeah.
creating a lot of havoc in our lives.
I love that. I love that you describe that emotion of defeated. That is a great example. And defeated has various levels, but people, if you're listening to this, you know what that feels like, right? Can you feel where you've had a moment where you felt that? It doesn't have to last forever, but sometimes it does, right? You could feel defeated about many or any aspect of your life, including relationships, right? I mean, that's where ego shows up a lot in love relationships.
Absolutely. And it might be very live and well in relationships where we are very challenged at times, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So, can we use the ego to serve us better? How do we do that?
Absolutely. Yes, we can. Number one thing, and the listeners may get tired of me hearing me say this. Number one, absolute most important step is the ability to take a step back and to step into awareness. Step out of the experience, okay? Step out of the feelings, step out of the story, step out and observe. And the first thing you do is you label what is happening. Oh, I'm telling myself this story that I really suck. I'm telling myself that I'm a horrible failure. So you step away and observe. Number one important thing to do. Once you do that, here's what's really interesting. Eckhart Tolle talked about the ego mind. I love this. He talked about the ego mind being like a giant snowman that melts under the light of consciousness. So the moment you take a step back, you recognize I'm telling myself this story. My inner critic is beating me up for this thing right then and there. It's gone. It's gone. It's like being a little kid and thinking there's a monster in your closet and you get the courage to get out of bed really fast and turn on the light and there's no monster, right? It's the same idea. The labeling, the taking a step back, separating from the story, labeling the story will take the power out of it. So that's first and foremost. Second thing is challenge the story, challenge it. What evidence do I have that refutes what I'm telling myself about myself? Okay, that's important. The other thing that's really critical is compassion and empathy. Ask yourself the question, whatever I'm saying to myself, would I ever say this to the person I love most? The answer is going to be no. And so empathy is critical. Compassion is critical. These are critical tools to get your ego back on track in terms of where it's supposed to be, in service of essence, in service of our beingness, in service of our goals, rather than being in charge of us or running the show.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you for this conversation, because we need to have more ways, more tools to help people. As the world gets more dynamic, as our brains keep trying to grow and expand beyond 10%, as we're trying to navigate this world, we have to remember what your show is about, and it's about empowered living. And that's really at the core of what you're doing, isn't it?
Yes, I am. Absolutely. Well, stay tuned for the next podcast of the Empowered Living Zone, where we'll be discussing even more stuff about the ego and lived experiences. I look forward to sharing more with you. Before we end today, once again, if you would like to contact me and learn more about empowered living and psychospiritual transformational life coaching, you can contact me through my website at www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. Again, www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. I want to thank Dr. Pat for being an inspiring partner. Thank you to all my listeners for tuning in to the Empowered Living Zone. Had a wonderful time as always. Please join me every first and third Tuesday of every month at 12 p.m. Pacific and 3 p.m. Eastern. Have a great week, and I'll see you here next time. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the Empowered Living Zone show with me, Dr. A, to create the life you crave. Tune in on the first and third Tuesdays at noon Pacific Time on transformationtalkradio.com and get ready for another show. Say yes to creating positive and empowering change in your life and move beyond life's challenging terrain into the zone of success. Be ignited by spirit, fueled by purpose, and guided by vision in the empowered living zone. For more information on how to do deep transformational work with me and to create the life you crave, visit empoweredlivingcoaching.com. That's empoweredlivingcoaching.com. See you next time.